So this is part A of the KhoodeelaarTV television channel, timed at 2020 GMT, starting a few minutes earlier. And this is the one that we shall be concentrating on the blank coverage or cover up by the papers, listed papers of the trial of Afsana Begum, the Member of Parliament for Poplar and Limehouse. She appeared for the third day on the 23rd of July 2021 at the Snaresbrook Crown Court in London, East London. And the only coverage that has been noticed about that is on the Daily Mail online. And they have summarized the allegations against her as being her having jumped the queue, housing waiting list. She waited for a few months, whereas the normal waiting is few years. This is the one from the Daily Telegraph, which is the second day of her kind of trial, but this is based on the first day, that is Wednesday, the 21st of July, and that is the one there. So what we shall be doing is talking generally about the housing situation, not necessarily about her case, but about the housing situation that has existed in Tower Hamlets Council for the entirety of the period up to now, from the beginning of Tower Hamlets Council being brought into existence in April 1965 by the merger of the then Stepney Council, Poplar Council, and Bethnal Green Council. In that period, council housing has undergone and put through a variety of steps. And the main changes have not been consistent. For example, we have said in the past that the Tower Hamlets Council's housing stock, the council housing stock was actually handed over by Tower Hamlets Council during the period of, let's say, 2004 to 2006. That's when the main handing over of the council housing stock took place. And what happened in 2004 and 2006 was a bogus consultation was conducted among existing tenants and residents in the council housing stock that was the subject of the transfer program. And the transfer was justified on the ground that the management of the council housing stock by the Tower Hamlets Council itself was producing poor value for money. That is to say, the management was bad and the various maintenance and service that Town Hamlets Council, as the landlord, carried out were too poor to be allowed to be continued. Now, that was done without carrying out any actual investigation or democratic accountability consultation about why that was. Why was there such a poor level of housing management by Town Hamlets Council? And the central point about that is that the elected councillors didn't do their job. The elected councillors in posts at the time didn't do their job properly or at all. And the main so-called consultation about the transfer of the housing stock was done, led by permanent or full-time employees of the council or some of the contractors that were hired for the purpose of disposing of the council housing stock. And this was something that was allowed to go ahead without the elected councillors making any intervention, democratic intervention, in terms of putting to the employees or the council's establishment the demands or the questions for answers. That was internally a failure by the council or the councillors. Remember, that was at least 4 years before the elected mayor post was imposed. That was between 2004 and 2006, let's say, mainly. The main handing over of the council housing stock took place. So there was no excuse. That is to say that the councillors were not legally allowed to intervene. That was internally the failure of the councillors themselves. Externally, that is to say, in relation to the electors in the borough, councillors didn't make any democratically owed disclosures or inform the council's voters as to what was going on. So the elected councillors failed in Town Hamlets, both externally and internally. Why were the councillors negligent? And the answer is that no explanation has existed or been made available in the period since the handover took place as to why the councillors played the role that they did, which is to collude with the transfer of the housing stock. And Town Hamlets being one of the most deprived boroughs, the electors, the voters, the tenants, residents in the borough still being among the groups of people in the country, in England, in the UK, with the lowest kind of per capita income generally. The need for housing, council housing, is among the highest in all of England. So no logical plan could support this handing over of considerable thousands of properties that could be rented at rates that could not be substituted, if you like, or replaced in a commercial kind of atmosphere. So the rate of the renting and the kind of sub-tenancies that were involved were very much within what is called the capacity of the low-income people. So it had direct ramification because the council properties being made unavailable to council housing applicants because the handover meant that the properties were handed over to third party or third parties. For example, the Haque is the biggest numbers of the properties were handed over to Haque. And another very significant number, but as compared to the Haque, the number was less than half, was Tower Hamlets community housing. So the culture of council housing was dramatically abolished in Tower Hamlets during the first half, let's say, of the first decade of this century. And there is no evidence that the council housing stock transferred to Haque and Tower Hamlets community housing has helped the availability of similar properties for the people in Tower Hamlets who had been in need of housing and who had been applying for council housing for a long time. So Tower Hamlets Council, although it is called a council, elected council, has ceased to be a democratic council when it comes to the biggest needs among the residents, which is the housing needs. And of course, it has ramifications on the needs about education, about employment, about health of the people who live in the borough. Of course, interference with the council housing stock didn't just happen in Tower Hamlets. It happened in other places as well, but the particular way that the Tower Hamlets Council housing stock was got rid of was unique. In nearby Hackney or nearby Newham, two of the other boroughs in East London, with populations experiencing long-term lack of income and poverty. Housing has been tampered with by the centrally passed legislation, right to buy. And again, the right to buy has been a capitalist business enterprise based on the assumption that poverty would be open to being exploited by the poor. That is impossible because there was no income from the right to buy available to those who didn't have the minimum requirements to be able to sell their status or exploit their status. It was only available to those who had the minimum required kind of qualifications. It was not generating income It was artificially inflating the values of the properties, thus creating a double kind of housing shortage. Because the people who had the entitlement to right to buy the current existing housing stock had to get rid of the occupation in order to make the money, that is, by renting the properties, owning the property, but renting the property, which means that they had to find other properties for their own use. And most of that entailed people moving out of their home areas, moving out of their estate, the neighborhood, and losing out democratically, because the demography, the characteristic, the cultural composition of the demography has got a direct impact on the democratic abilities on the part of people to vote in a particular way. So housing has been dismantled in Tar Hamlets, or the council housing, and with that, significant numbers of people have been displaced, democratically displaced and disenfranchised. So the strength in numbers of the electorate in order to kind of negotiate and bargain with the wannabe potential kind of elected councillors seeking election candidates has been weakened. And it's going to get worse. This is now 2021. So it's 15, 16 years ago that the transfer began to take place, this housing stock. But the right to buy started even before. So a series of kind of undermining of the stock, housing stock, and the availability. And with that decrease, the strength of democracy and democracy negotiations has been undermined. And there is nothing, no platform, no forum that argues for the poorest people and their say. So when people go to the council, the bureaucracy exists in name in order to deal with the council's obligations. But the obligations have been seriously kind of denied by a third attack mounted in Tar Hamlets on council housing. And that third attack was carried out by several series of television programs intended to undermine the claim about council housing. And those series of attacks took place via the Channel 4 television program called How to Get a Council House. And the whole theme was to deny the council's obligations to house people. Flatly deny. And despite the fact that about 4 programs specifically about Tar Hamlets Council's denial of housing duties, no councillor took part, no councillor appeared on any of the programs. None of the leaders of the councils, for example, this whole thing happened after the elected mayor post was created, and there was nothing in any of the programs. 4 series, I think, of the programs that was said. about the council's duties, the legal duties, and the implications and the impact of the denial of the duties and obligations by the Term-Less Council. So that's the third one. And the fourth one was, of course, done by Channel 4, called the Undercover Boss. The Undercover Boss was a program that pretended to be undercover, but actually it was a brazen denial of transparency, and it was a corrupt series. And this one was done by featuring Kevin Collins, who was chief executive at the time. And again, the thrust of Kevin Collins' program was to deny the truth. And it was actually based on a lot of denials about housing duties to the most in need of housing in Tar Hamlets. So there are 4 attacks. There have been 4 attacks on council housing. And those attacks have meant that thousands of additional people have been put on the homeless housing waiting list, housing corruption, housing overcrowding waiting lists by Tar Hamlets Council itself. So it is extraordinary that while all of these attacks were taking place, a number of councillors were engaged in abusing their positions, their knowledge, and their kind of access to information about what was available within the council. So 3 councillors so far have been prosecuted for housing fraud, and all 3 of them have been jailed whatever period of time. That is evidence of widespread housing fraud and criminality done by the council itself. 3 councillors. So we shall be updating on this in due course. And we are not looking at the newspapers today at this stage.